What is going on, y'all? KM Best here. I have some bad news about Marvel Snap's newest card, Thaddeus Ross. The big TTR, as they call him, Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross, is a 2/2 that has an ability that when your opponent ends a turn with unspent energy, you draw a card that has 10 or more power. Now, this is actually genuinely not a bad card. I realize the video is I have some bad news about him, and there is still plenty of bad news to come. But I do think that there is something to be said for this being sort of a default option in a Surtur deck. I can see that. It's just that it's very much the least important card in a Surtur deck. It is competing for card number 12. The other 11 cards are pretty much already locked in. Surtur and Skaar are going to be very relevant at doing what they do, and Thaddeus can be useful and can be helpful, but there are other cards that can also be useful and helpful. For example, his most common competition in that deck is Iron Patriot, which is quite a good card, even if it doesn't fit perfectly in that list, Psylocke, which has a little more synergy with the deck, and of course Juggernaut, which can really steal wins at the end of games. And don't get me wrong, this guy does do some very valuable stuff. If your opponent is skipping and you are drawing a card, getting that additional draw towards getting that Skaar in your hand is really, really good. The other problem this guy has is that he is conditional. If you were playing him every game and he just said, draw a 10 power guy, that guy probably goes in the deck and stays in the deck. But he isn't that, and you don't get that every single time. And so I think if this guy were, say, 2/3 draw a 10 power guy, that's a card that we really have to consider as a very powerful option in a wide variety of spaces, let alone in the Surtur deck. But because he's so conditional and he's definitely not that, it's a little bit harder to actually make him work. And that means that you're going to see him in a couple of different spots. Obviously, you will see him in the Surtur deck, but he's definitely not worth the 6,000 tokens, because even if he is an upgrade, and I think most people would argue that he's not, you can still play a card like Psylocke and not actually feel like you're losing out on anything. And Psylocke, of course, is free instead of 6,000 tokens or X amount of cash keys. Now, that does leave Thaddeus in a sort of awkward spot for a new card. There's just not a lot of stuff going on with this guy, and that means that he only has a couple other homes outside of Surtur. We're going to take a look at 4 decks here, and I'm also going to try to dive into what I think went wrong in terms of how this card came out like this, and what it is they were looking at versus what it is they should have been looking at. This is the Surtur deck that I was playing with Thaddeus in it, and I want to stress that this is not a bad deck. In fact, I think that it's very likely that because Thaddeus is only going to go in a deck like this most of the time, that he'll come out with like a fairly high win rate, maybe on some of the stat sites that might mislead people. The reason I think that is because when cards that are specific to certain decks tend to show up, they end up looking a little bit stronger than they actually are if the package they're going into is already strong. And to my mind, Surtur is one of, if not the strongest deck in the game, especially when you start looking at untapped data, which sort of trends toward less skilled players on the whole than the very tippy top of Infinite, which means that there is more value in a deck that is very easy to play, like Scream Surtur. I played this deck, I climbed a lot with it, it was very good, but Thaddeus Ross wasn't really a big part of it. I will note that when I did switch him out for Juggernaut, I started doing worse, but there is potentially a tilt factor there as well. He is a very fine and reasonable card in this deck. I really don't want people to look at this and be like, he sucks even in the deck he's supposed to go in, because he honestly does not suck. It's just that that is your only real slot to get some real flavor into your deck. You can put a Juggernaut in there, you can put an Iron Patriot in there. There's just stuff you can do with that slot that people might prefer over what I would describe as a fairly boring and anodyne Thaddeus Ross. And I think that this guy would be in the exact same position even if he were a 2/3, even if he, like, and once you get to like 2/4, that's when it's like, all right, well, this guy would probably be in a bunch of stuff. But as is, I don't even think it's a question of his stat line. I think it's a question of his ability. And the issue that his ability has is that right now, there are not a lot of decks that are taking turns off, and the ones that are taking turns off are going very far over your head. Like, okay, thanks for drawing me a Cull Obsidian against Mr. Negative, I'm still going to lose. Thanks for drawing me whatever against discard, I'm still going to lose. The decks that are that this is actually applicable against are the ones that you don't actually need the condition to be happening. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure I'm making a ton of sense here, but like what I'm saying is this is a deck that really wants Thaddeus to go off against mid-range decks, because those mid-range decks are where free Skaars are good. But you don't get him going off against mid-range decks. You only get him going off against matchups that actually have the ability to make your free Skaar not matter at all. And that's, I think, the ultimate issue that you run into with this card, which is, unless your opponent is turbo bricking, all the mid-range decks are gonna be able to curve out, and as soon as they see it, they're gonna focus on curving out, and every mid-range deck is playing like 5 2-drops because they're a bunch of amazing 2-drops, and so they're never missing on turn 2 either. And so you just have this card that is like good, but it's definitely not good enough, and it's an easily replaceable card, even in, while I will say the deck is very good, Thaddeus is good in it, it's still not necessarily a good enough reason to buy him. If you want a deck that actually does rely on Thaddeus and actually does want you to have Thaddeus and actually gets a meaningful boost from Thaddeus existing, the Moon Girl Evo Hulk deck is not a bad option. However, massive but here, the deck is still bad. Like, yes, he actually does do something meaningful for you here, getting you those She-Hulks in hand, getting that Hulk in hand, getting through your deck. This is actually like the kind of deck that he meaningfully is helping. The issues it runs into are like cards like Mobius exist. It's a fairly predictable deck, and so if it has 3 spots in a lane field, it's got a pretty capped output as long as they're tracking your Hulk. This is a deck that genuinely does want you to play Thaddeus Ross. It does actually really benefit from even one proc of the Thad. However, the problem you have when you try to do this is that your deck is bad, and Thaddeus doesn't make it that much better. He does improve it, and I think if you're someone who picked up Thaddeus and you're like, God, I just really want something to play with this guy that I actually care about him in, this is the best option for you. I think the Hela deck is also like a fairly plausible option here, where I do think that you care so little about all the stuff you do that isn't Hela, that you're just totally willing to play a card that might draw you a card that is relevant at some point in the game. Like, yeah, it's not doing it all the time, but if it does it even like half the time, I think you're probably fine with putting a 2/2 like this into your deck. You don't really care about the rest. Again, though, we see that Thaddeus is improving the consistency of these decks, but these decks are not ones that he is improving enough to be relevant in the metagame, or I would say more relevant in the metagame. I do think if you're like some sort of Moon Girl high Evo truther, you probably should pick up Thaddeus Ross, but I also hope that that kind of person doesn't exist. And I think the same for Hela, although it's going to be like, do I really need it in Hela? Like, this is a deck that I do think is improved by him, but I don't necessarily know if it's like, wow, I have to have Thaddeus. In fact, I kind of doubt that, but he does give you some legitimate extra juice in those games where you have like discarded your Hela or whatever, because he is suddenly drawing gas for you some of the time, and you can actually just be a Corvus Glaive ramp deck. Like, it's not nothing. He is meaningfully improving you here, and I do think that in these two decks, it's a lot harder for me to look at it and be like, I know exactly what card I'd rather play here. Maybe you can look at it and be like, let me get a Gore in here, etc., etc. But especially this build of Hela just hasn't been good in a while for pretty obvious reasons, right? And so I don't really think Thaddeus is going to be worth purchasing for this. It's possible he goes here. Like, if this guy is drawing a card, you are in a good spot, and this is a very solid deck. But he is just by far the worst of the twos that you have access to. And you could be playing a lot of other things instead of him. And that sort of leaves you at like, why am I bothering here? It is cute that he draws your Heimdall. It is cute that he draws your Cull Obsidian. All that stuff is cute. But Scream is a mid-range deck that is aiming to really get in the muck with other mid-range decks. I would rather use that tech slot on a card that actually solves my bad matchups instead of maybe helping the ones that I'm already very confident in. In other words, that should probably be a Mobius. So what exactly went wrong here? What is it that this card is not able to do that they thought it would be able to do? And I'm looking through it to sort of figure that out, but ultimately, I think it's maybe just a misunderstanding of a couple of things. Thing number one, there are way more good 2-drops right now than there were even a month and a half ago. We have decks that are playing Victoria Hand on 2. We have decks that are playing Iron Patriot on 2. We have a lot of decks that are just using their entire turn 2. In addition, Sam Wilson just came out. Again, we have 2 season passes running of extremely elite tempo 2-drops. And when you have a bunch of extremely elite tempo 2-drops, what happens is Thaddeus Ross runs into a deck that is playing a better card than Thaddeus Ross on turn 2, and then they also might be playing the same Surtur backend that you are. And so you end up with this card that, if there were less staple 2-drops in the metagame, could be drawing a card on turn 2 fairly often. We've been in metagames like that before we had good 2s, but now we have amazing 2s. Sam Wilson is everywhere. You have Scream, who is everywhere. You have Iron Patriot, who is everywhere. And so you're not getting to free roll the turn 2, and you're giving up something by not running one of those cards. And I think that's ultimately what happens to Thaddeus Ross, because the way I got to this line of thought was I was like, if he was a 2-3, would that actually even help? And the answer is like, kind of, because it would make him less embarrassing to play into an Iron Patriot, but not really. Like, it would be nice, but I don't think it would solve any of the issues that the card has in terms of metagame-wide dynamics. I do wonder what it takes for them to buff a card while it's still in caches. I don't really know at this point, because we've had some stinkers that haven't been buffed, and then we've had some good cards that just didn't get changed at all. And I think personally that it's fairly unlikely a card like this gets changed, because they've seen the downside of doing that. And I can tell you for damn sure that this card isn't worse than Bruce Banner, so maybe it just never gets changed. Like, Bruce Banner was so bad and got so nowhere and only went in decks that were bad and are bad. And I guess he's still like fine. So if they're not going to change Bruce, I don't really see them changing him. But when I look at this card, one of the things I think about is like, this is almost the reverse Bruce Banner situation, where both of them were made for a deck. Bruce sucked because the deck sucked. Thad sucks because he just isn't good enough to justify his own existence in the deck despite being fine, right? Like, he won't be 6,000 tokens worth of value, basically, no matter how you slice it. And that's actually the problem. I don't exactly know how much potential this card has going forward. Like, I do think it's possible there's use cases we're missing. I do think it's possible that there's worlds where things change around and, you know, maybe some of the 2s get nerfed, or maybe there's a real combo application for this that people can find. Because I do think that there is some intent for this to be a combo card that it just cannot be right now, because there isn't a combo deck that it truly wants to go in. We talked about 2 of them. Neither of them are good enough, right? And maybe if they were good enough, he would have much more readily available homes, but they're not, so he doesn't. And so you have a card that I think is not good enough to justify his own price tag. And honestly, that feels bad, I think. Like, I don't even know what you should do about fixing this card. I mean, I think most cards, if you just gave him a 3-5 stat line, that would be fine. It would work. I think you could do that to Thad. Like, I think you could make him like a 2-4 or 3-5 or something, and it'd be like, yeah, okay, I'll play him now. But it's just such an odd ability on a card that when I read it, I was like, that has to be strong. And then you play it and it's like, it just isn't. And actually, I don't even know if it just isn't is the right way to phrase it. He was good. He just wasn't 6,000 tokens good. And he was only good in one deck. And that makes it almost impossible to justify the purchase. And that's sort of where I'm at with big ol' Thaddeus Ross. Thanks so much for watching. As always, I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.